Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing the crisis in Ukraine, where dozens have been killed, hundreds injured in the last week. Joining me now from Berlin is Joerg Forbrig. He is an Eastern European expert with the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and Alexander Nekrassov. He's a former special advisor to the Kremlin. I want to welcome both of you to the show. Joerg, why don't I start with you? You've been making the case that Ukraine's future actually lies with the European Union and not Russia. Has that belief been shaken at all as a result of all the violence we've witnessed this week?
No, not at all. If anything, it's been reinforced by the developments this week. Let me also take this opportunity here to extend my sympathies to all those who have suffered during the violence, to those who have been killed or injured, and of course their families. And that is on both sides of the divide. But to return to your question, I think the broader case that I'm making is that Ukraine, if taking a more European path of direction of development, would have definite opportunities, chances to look like Poland today. I think the parallels between these two countries are striking, but of course 20 years ago they took different paths of development, and we see the differences today. So I believe that if there was a European development of Ukraine, then the future would look as Poland looks today. If, on the other hand, Ukraine decided to do the about turn in the direction of Russia, then I fear that it would soon look like Belarus today.
Well, Alexander, let me get you to jump in here as well. I know that in Russia, some are describing this as an attempted coup. How would you view what's happened this last week?
Well, I think it does start to look like an attempted coup after the so-called protesters, because I call them so-called, suddenly got armed, started shooting at the police. I think we are talking about dozens of policemen already shot and wounded. So it's very difficult now to talk about a peaceful demonstration, or as they're called here in Britain by some media outlets, as democracy demonstrators. I think that the problem here is this, is that Russia and Europe can be both friends to Ukraine. I don't understand why this divide is put in. Why is that people in the European Union are saying, no, Ukraine has to go with us solely? Why is that? Why can't Ukraine be in the middle and deal with both sides? That's the first point. The second strong point is that the so-called free association agreement, and believe me, I've read it. I'm probably one of the few who has read it. This was not a good deal for Ukraine. Any government, and I was advising the Russian government as well as the president, any government, sane government, would have rejected this plan. Russia gave a better deal, and I don't understand why the Ukrainian government is coming under such criticism for choosing a better deal.
Joerg, let me get your thoughts on both of these points, but let's start with this belief that Ukraine ought to be able to just straddle both worlds, the West and the East. What's wrong with that?
Well, unfortunately, this is not an option anymore. This is not by the doing of the Ukrainians. This is not by the doing of the Europeans. This is, unfortunately, by the doings of Russia. Russia is the side that in this conflict does not leave Ukrainians a choice. We should remember that in negotiating the association agreement, two equal sides sat around the table. This was the European Union and this was Ukraine. I do agree that it was the free choice of the government eventually not to sign this agreement, because I do believe that there were serious deficits in the offer that the European Union made. Be that as it may, we are talking about two equals sitting at the table negotiating an agreement. Russia, on the other hand, has been putting enormous pressure on Ukraine in the last phases of the process towards the association agreement, and it basically threatened to cripple the country economically should it sign this agreement.
Alexander, let's kind of dovetail off that, because you said, why can't they be in both camps, the West and the East? And Joerg's making the point, the reason they can't is because of pressure from Vladimir Putin and the Russian government.
Well, you know, we've heard a lot about this so-called pressure by Russia on everyone, you know, from the former Soviet Union. Let me put this point to you. the things that are happening inside the European Union are not that great. Now, let me give you an example. Here in Britain, the people want a referendum. 64% are saying, no, it's not a good deal for us. We want not maybe out completely, but we want to review our relations with the EU. We want to take back our powers. The EU is damaging our industry. It is damaging our social fabric. It is damaging even our legal system, right? So here's Britain. That's one country. Ask anybody in Greece. Ask anybody in Italy. Ask anybody in Spain. Ask anybody in Ireland. They will tell you that they have serious problems with the EU. Now we come to another point. The so-called revival of the economy in the European Union. Now, I was a former advisor to the finance minister of Russia for 3 years. And I can tell you, as an expert on finance, the finances of the European Union are in a terrible shape. They have printed so many new euros that their real inflation rate is much higher. Their so-called recovery is artificial. And all these statistics that they throw at us to show that they are booming and it's wonderful, it's not. The problems in France are terrible. So the only country that really benefits from it all is Germany. Germany has been benefiting from it all for all the existence of the euro, the single currency. So from the point of view of people in Ukraine, the people who understand the situation and not the ones who were conned into thinking that this association agreement with the EU would give them absolutely high living standards, freedom to travel across Europe, which it won't, by the way. They will have to ask for visas and negotiate with every country. So these people who understand the real situation basically look at the EU as a sort of a model of the Soviet Union, with an unelected leadership sitting in Brussels, deciding for other countries what to do. Why should countries actually strive to join the European Union? Okay. Why don't they accept the European Union they need to put some order?
Your point's been well made. Let me give Joerg a chance to respond to that. You know, and the other point I think that Alexander's trying to make is that Russia did extend some financial help to Ukraine right off the bat, and that was one of the complaints as well, that there was no financing coming to them right off the bat. They're in a terrible straits right now. In terms of short term, the Russian deal looked a lot better to Yanukovych than the EU.
Russia offered short-term help. It offered $15 billion that would be enough to help President Yanukovych to survive the time until the next presidential elections. This is not a sustainable solution. This is only basically a bridging grant in order to help this president to stay in office until the next elections. In the long run, Russia cannot even afford to provide these subsidies to Ukraine. If you look at Russia's economy today, it is in rather critical condition. This is not the booming oil-based economy anymore. This is basically an economy that has slowed down to a point of almost zero growth. And it's very doubtful that Russia would, in the long run, be able to subsidize countries like Ukraine, as it already also is subsidizing neighboring Belarus to the tune of $7 billion a year. How do you imagine Russia can afford this in the long run? So in that sense, I would say Russia's offer was very short-termed for a very political reason, that is to keep Yanukovych in office until the next presidential elections.
Joerg, I want to ask you another question about the protesters. There is a hard-right extremist element to this group of protesters. Does that concern you?
Yes, of course. Now, I think we should see the evolution of those protests from the very beginning, and we should see the reason why parts of this protest movement have become radicalized. When the protests started, it basically consisted of students taking to the streets to express their desire to live in a European country, to have similar standards of living, also life chances as their European peers. That was the first moment when police stepped in and suppressed these protests brutally. This is when then others joined. This is when the protest movement snowballed. As time wore on, because President Yanukovych very skillfully employed basically a tactic of dragging it out, buying time, trying to see the protests basically frozen off the street by the winter. as there were negotiations with the opposition which bore no fruit because they were not intended to be fruitful on part of the government. Obviously, some parts of the protest movement radicalized because they saw no solution in the political process. This is very unfortunate, but I do think this is a natural result of the tactics employed by President Yanukovych and the unfortunate outcomes of it we see today.
Well, let me let Alexander respond to that question as well. Are you concerned about this extremist element of the protest groups?
Well, of course it's very dangerous. And what I would stress here is that when politicians and experts accuse the government of heavy-handedness, I'd like you to look at the casualty figures, and you will find out, for example, that on one day, out of the 25 or 26 people killed, half were policemen. Now, excuse me, that shows to me that the government is not really heavy-handed, that the police are not allowed, by the way, to use heavy-handed tactics. And the police were issued ammunition, live ammunition, only after several days of killings. So to say that the government was heavy-handed, I don't agree with that at all. I also don't agree with the suggestion that it was all peaceful and quiet and the protesters just stood there and wanted to become part of Europe. No, it wasn't. The extremists moved in very quickly. And you know why it happened? I can tell you why it happened. Because the opposition, in the face of the former heavyweight boxing champion Vitaly Klitschko and others, they have nothing to offer. They have no program. They have nothing at all apart from demanding to become part of Europe. This is not a platform to deal with anything. And when they were offered, by the way, seats in the cabinet and even the prime ministerial seat, they immediately withdrew from that. You know why? Because they have nothing to offer. And that is the main point here. The extremists took over when they realized there's a vacuum, that these so-called leaders of the opposition, they go and talk to Angela Merkel and other Western leaders, discussing Ukraine as if they have the authority, the mandate to do that. That is absolutely preposterous. What we are witnessing there is the EU having lost control of the situation and basically encouraging these protesters to continue to do what they are doing. This is a very, very dangerous course. It can lead to a civil war. We can't allow a civil war to break out in Ukraine, because if anybody of you wonders how a third world war can start in Europe, that's one of the scenarios.
Well, Alexander, we're going to have to leave it there. Alexander joining us from London, Joerg from Berlin. Thank you both for joining us here on The Heat.